All right, this is the relationship between violent video games and human physiology. So for an introduction, video games and violence have been synonymous with each other ever since video games were really created. And the playing of violent video games has been believed to be an influence over time on those who play it, specifically among adolescents. And so this has led to multiple controversies surrounding violent video games. And really things started to kick off in 1993 when Ed Boon and John Tobias released the arcade game Mortal Kombat, which saw brutal fatalities and violent action in which people would get their heads ripped off or their spines torn out of their back. And so this really upset parents. And so later that year in 1993, Senators Joe Lieberman of Connecticut and Herb Kohl of Wisconsin led a Senate hearing about violence in video games. They heard from concerned parents, they heard from the makers of Mortal Kombat, among others. And in the end, they created the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or the ESRB, which then monitored games and sorted them from an appropriate age rating from E to everyone to M for mature, which is meant for ages 18 and up. However, this has not stopped the youth from playing these T for teen and M for mature games, which incite violence in their video games. And this could cause potential dangers, as violent video games have still become a scapegoat in events like school shooting and physical aggression among youth. Additionally, I have noticed that I've become rather aggressive when playing these violent video games, which has led me to go into this research. So the primary research question being asked is, what is the relationship between violent video games and human physiology in adolescent males? As aggression is something that cannot be measured, there needs to be a medium that can be measured in order to form some sort of hypothesis as to whether or not the aggression is really there. Thus, I used heart rate readings because it signals the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, specifically releasing its chemicals that cause a fight or flight response within the person. This spikes the heart rate and shows signs of aggression within the person. And should the heart rate go up and stimulate a feeling of aggression, it should prove my hypothesis correct, which is that there is a direct relationship between violent video games and human physiology in adolescent males. Looking at the literature review, first piece of literature is Maladaptive Neurovisceral Interactions in Patients with Internet Gaming Disorder, a study of heart rate variability and functional neurocognitive using the graph theory approach by Sumi Park and her colleagues. And so her research question was, how do heart rate variable measurements display symptoms of internet gaming disorder in human beings? And so they used a mixed method where they had 111 patients take a survey about internet gaming disorder and then had their heart rate measured in a resting state. And they found out that heart rate variable graphs and heart rate showed that people with internet gaming disorder showed signs of maladaptive brain-body integration features involving disruptions of the autonomic nervous system. And this piece of literature pertained to my research in that it gave me kind of a medium where I could sort of measure out how we could find this aggressive feeling in adolescent males, specifically through heart rate and heart rate variability. So the next piece of literature is the effects of violent video games on aggressive behavior, aggressive cognition, aggressive effect, physiological arousal, and prosocial behavior, a meta-analytical review of the scientific nature by Craig Anderson and Brad Bushman. And their research question is, does the playing of violent video games increase aggressive behavior? And so they used a meta-analytical method where they had participants come in and play the video games, where they took measurements about the participant. Their result was that violent video games increased aggressive behavior in children and young adults, and it also increased physiological arousal and caused more aggressive thoughts and feelings. And this pertained to my research because it sort of gave me an outlet as to how I should go about doing it. And it also showed existing literature that studied a similar result and found a data consistent with the hypothesis. And then my final two pieces of literature start with the effects of pathological gaming on aggressive behavior by Jurion S. Lemmings, Patty M. Falkenberg, and Joe Chan Peter. And their research question was, does longer exposure to violent video games increase aggressive gaming habits and physical aggression? And so their method was a case study because they studied 851 Dutch adolescents over time, and then they did something similar to Anderson and Bushman where they had their variables taken while playing the game. And they found out that more time spent playing violent video games did increase aggression, specifically in adolescent boys. And this pertains to my research because at an all-boys Catholic high school, it sort of gave me a group to primarily focus on with this research. And then finally, Salman Khalil and his colleagues in the impact of playing violent video games among school-going children as to whether or not the playing of violent video games among school-going children increased aggression, specifically with their behavior. And they used a mixed method where they gave a questionnaire to 400 Indian students about demographics, behaviors, exposure, etc. with violent video games, and they had them play while recording the measurements. And ultimately, they found out that aggressive behaviors were increased, specifically among boys. like Lemons, Valkenburg, and Peter. This kind of helped me narrow a demographic, and it also kind of put a place for my survey where I could ask some of these questions. And so ultimately for my method, I did a mixed method because I used a quantitative data analysis as well as distributed survey. So using a quantitative data analysis allowed me to process my findings and connect them to my hypothesis. And should the data trends be consistent there, it will show that the hypothesis is correct, that that physiological response and the fight or flight response and that heart rate increase does contribute to the playing of violent video games. And as I am conducting research on human beings and we put them in a stressful situation, I can go through the school's IRB process. And so the survey grasped the participants' relationship with violence and violent video games. And the important questions asked were time spent on video games, frequency of video games played, and how inclined participants feel to play certain games over others, specifically genres that do or do not include violence. And then at the end of the questionnaire, I asked participants whether or not they wanted to participate in the research and also gave them a waiver consent form for minors to have their parents sign. And so for the actual research, it involved the participants playing one round of the game mode Team Deathmatch, which took around 15 minutes. And this is from the first-person shooter Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, released in 2022. And I had them play on a PlayStation 4 console. So when participants arrived in the testing center, they were sat down for exactly 5 minutes in order to slow down and rest heart rate so we can see what the resting heart rate was. Once that happened, I took down the measurements of the resting heart rate and then had them play the game. And then as soon as they finished playing the game, I recorded their heart rate again to see what the heart rate was afterwards. And doing this allowed me to see the comparison of pre and post heart rates, which could show that spike in aggression. Going on to the results, it's important first to discuss the findings of what actually happened. So a total of 83 people responded to the survey. However, 77 said that they did play video games, so I took that into account in further survey questions. But of those 77, 13 people agreed to do my research. And so these are the results from playing before and after. So the graphs in blue show the heart rate before playing the game. The blue graphs in red showing the heart rate after playing the game. And the numbers at the bottom just show the number of the participants. So the first two graphs belong to participant 1, the next two graphs belong to participant 2, and so on. And so we can see that the overall trend is that the heart rate did increase when playing video games. However, participants 1 and participants 10 actually had a lower heart rate while playing the games, and participants 7 and participants 12 actually remained at a constant heart rate. So the first essential survey question asked respondents how likely they are to play video games that included violence on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, with 5 being very likely and 1 being not very likely. And so in the pie chart of figure 2, 37% of participants gave a rating of 5, 31% gave a rating of 4, 22% giving a rating of 3, the final 9% being 1 over 2. The next essential question is shown in figure 3, which asked how many days a week do we play video games. So around 54% of respondents only play for 1 to 2 days a week. 28% play 3 to 4 times a week, and the other 16% play for 5 or more days per week. And interestingly enough, from the last question, people said that they play, or 51% of people said that they play video games for around 1 to 2 hours per day, with 29% playing just less than an hour per day, and 25% playing 3 or more hours per day. So these two are kind of factored in together later. And so figure 4 shows the responses to the question, how many hours per day do you play video games, which is what I just mentioned. 48% of the respondents indicated that they only play games for 1 to 2 hours per week, with 28% saying that they play for less than an hour, and 22% saying that they play for 3 to 5 hours. And so only 2% of respondents said that they play for 6 to 9 hours or more. Finally, on to the discussion. There should be a better understanding of these graphs as well as the surveying questions. So let's start with figure 1. Figure 1 is interpreted. It appears that around 9 out of 13 participants, or 69%, saw their heart rate increase. And the exceptions were, of course, participants 1 and 10 who saw a decrease, and participants 7 and 12 who remained at a constant heart rate. And so from this sample size, we can assume that there's a trend being shown which states that playing violent video games increases one's sympathetic nervous activity and that fight or flight response, which thus increases their heart rate. And so this was able to be accomplished in a controlled setting that was able to eliminate any external factors before the person plays so that it did not mess up resting heart rate readings. And so that trend kind of bolsters the hypothesis that there is a direct relationship between violence and human physiology. And so in order to understand why that general trend skewed that way, Figure 2 should be examined as well. And as shown, 37% of participants indicated that they were very likely to play violent video games, and 31% indicating that they were more likely to play violent video games than non-violent video games. And so of those who participated in the research, 9 participants indicated that they were more likely or very likely to play violent video games. And this could have contributed to the overall trend because we had a higher percentage of people that said that they were more likely or very likely to play violent video games, and showed that heart rate, which shows that the more violent video games played, the more that fight or flight response is active and that aggression could increase. And so the survey was also meant to measure the gaming habits of participants, specifically through their playtime and their tendency to play certain video games. And so as discovered, a discovered side result of the survey actually was that some of the people fit the criteria for gaming addiction, which many people actually believe enhance the effects of violent video game exposure. However, the results that we got on the graph actually prove that the participants who had a gaming addiction did not display any significant differences in their heart rates than non-addicted players. And so 5 of the 13 participants met the criteria for video games addiction, which requires an average of around 15 hours or more of gaming per week, while the other 8 did not. And this is found through Figure 3 and Figure 4, which ask participants about how many days a week they play and how often they play. Because the addicted players had to respond that they were likely to play for at least 5 days with at least 3 hours or more of gaming per day. Moving on, there were multiple implications that arose from the findings of the research. However, of all of the implications of the research, the most important one is that the results directly supported both the hypothesis and the existing literature surrounding this research. And almost every piece of literature used in the literature review, specifically from Anderson and Bushman, Lemons, Valkenburg, and Peter and Khalil, all came to a result that violent video games did increase aggression among adolescents and non-adolescents as well. But looking at the graph, it did show that an overall trend was there, that that heart rate went up and that fight or flight response was active, and so that did increase overall aggression. And additionally, it also clears a gap in the research because there isn't too much there, specifically delving into human physiology. However, this research did go into fight or flight response and that heart rate variability, so we can see that it actually does impact your body when you're playing these violent video games. I also believe there are some limitations to the research. First of all, it's limited to just one gender. We also didn't have too much time to play it because everybody just played the game once. And there could have been a wider amount of people than just 13 that played it. And then again, the most interesting trend that I wasn't aware of was that addiction. And this could go into further research because we could see if these addicted players really don't have a significant change or if they do. And so in conclusion, the results were supportive of the hypothesis that there is a direct relationship between violent video games and human physiology in adolescent males, as shown through that fight or flight response and that heart rate increase. There was a bit of a caveat to the results, as shown in the limitations, as there could have been both genders involved in the study, as well as more people. In addition, there was the side result of addiction, which could lead to further research. Any questions?
Yeah, Avi, terrific. Thanks so much for that presentation. Okay, so for the first question, how did your initial exploration of the scholarly work at the start of the year lead to your final research question? Talk about that process.
Yeah, so ultimately, I kind of felt like I wanted to do something with video games, but I was really unsure. And so I kind of realized again that I get kind of aggressive in playing these violent video games, and I talked to you about it. And like we were saying, there was a lot of existing research about that. So I went and I looked and I saw that people were really coming to this conclusion that these violent video games did increase that violent tendency. So I ended up going with that, and it really helped form that research question because I kind of saw what other people did and helped me kind of form my own things. And I also looked at that gap of no human physiology, and I said, well, I could look into this a little bit more.
Terrific. And then as a follow-up, how does your new understanding address the gap in existing research?
Yeah. Well, like I said, there's a gap between the human physiology in it. People don't really dive into that too much. They just look at outside and external aggression. But now that we see that it actually has an impact on our bodies, it can lead to sort of a new scientific understanding of that gap, and we could dive more into how else does the playing of violent video games affect our bodies and why isn't that activating that sympathetic nervous system response.
Okay, terrific. And then finally, think back to the initial curiosity that made you think about this process, right? Now that you've completed your research on it, did going through the process inspire new curiosities about doing new research?
I would say so, because now I have this curiosity about gaming addiction. I kind of want to see, do these addicts really show more aggressive signs, or is it more consistent with this research, and are they kind of on the same level as people that don't have a video game addiction?